now we see countries also recognizing the momentum that's building.
Tonight, we will talk to visionary Andy Mok, an expert on public policy and China-U.S. relations. Andy Mok is an investor, entrepreneur, and policy analyst, specializing in business management, private equity, and public policy in China.
Give us some examples of what...
He's a regular media commentator on China's economy and a consultant for companies looking to break into the country's markets.
So when we look at the five...
Andy, it's so funny because when this started, it was One Belt, One Road, then it became BRI, and I think initially a lot of people in the West were like, what's China doing? Are they like building a road? What's going on? Do you think people have a clearer understanding now of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, I think today there's much more awareness about the Belt and Road. Now, how much of it is actually based on fact versus maybe misperception or prejudice, I think is another question. And one issue is, I think the name itself is a little bit confusing because originally it was OBOR, right? One Belt, One Road. And actually the road referred to the maritime part of it and the belt referred to the land part of it. I think now this new nomenclature of BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is better. But I think China, the government, the party also recognizes the need to do a better job of communicating what exactly the BRI is, and I'm very optimistic about that.
How are they doing on that? Because you keep hearing all the negative questions of, is this a debt trap? I mean, you hear a lot of the same sorts of questions, a new form of colonialism. Are they doing a better job of explaining it, do you think?
I think they are. And I mean, as someone that works in the media industry and has one foot in the world of Western media and one foot in the world of Chinese media, but also very actively looking at what other voices in the media world are saying, whether that's Africa, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, that the Western media narrative is exactly as you said, Mike. It's this awful thing. It's Machiavellian, it's debt trap, it's neo-colonialism. And it's a little bit of an echo chamber, unfortunately, but I think that if you talk to most people outside of the mainstream Western media, I think the views are not uniformly negative. Of course, there are questions and some concerns, but I think by and large, the countries that are actually involved, say in Africa, in Central Asia, generally view this as very, very positive. And these voices are starting to become heard in the Western media.
But it's not like a gun at the head. It's not, you have to repay this instantly. I mean, it does allow these countries to kind of get things going and start to generate the wealth that obviously infrastructure can do. I mean, China's seen it itself, hasn't it?
It certainly has, Mike. I mean, if we want to say, look at high-speed rail, for example, China started with one high-speed rail link, from the Pudong airport to not even quite Shanghai, right? And now today it has the largest high-speed railway network in the world. And it's not 5 times the amount of the US or even 50 times, but 500 times the amount that the US has. And we can see through this how much economic benefit it has brought to China, and we can see also the benefit it is bringing to other parts of the world.
The prospect of utilizing high-speed trains wasn't lost on the United States. California first proposed them in 1981. And in 1996, the state formally began planning to put the project up for a vote. The vote came in 2008. In the following years, the White House awarded the state more than $6 billion for the project.
It's interesting you bring that up because earlier this week, I jumped on a train from Beijing to Shanghai, spent the afternoon in Shanghai, was back in bed in my hotel at the end of the day. It's over 1,000 kilometers. You look at California, I remember the California governor at the time, Jerry Brown, coming here in 2013, taking the bullet train, the exact same route that I had taken, talking about doing this in California. There's been cost overruns, and yet it's only about 600 kilometers from San Francisco to LA. It's now stalled. It may go from Fresno to Bakersfield, something like that. Why is it the U.S. struggles with this? And yet China seems to not have that much trouble doing this sort of thing.
No, that's a great question. And to give, I think, our audience a little bit of context here, Mike, you mentioned the Beijing to Shanghai high-speed rail route. Well, let's look at this. The distance from DC to Dallas right now in the US takes about 44 hours by train. A comparable distance from Beijing to Hong Kong can be done in 8 hours. And this is one of the new legs of the high-speed rail that has been opened. So you ask, why is this? I think one of the main reasons is, again, it comes down to a very different political system. And we look at, put aside whether it's a democracy in the way Americans think of democracy versus, say, the Chinese think about democracy, but just the organization of government, so that in China, it's very, very centralized, top down. So meaning Zhongnanhai, which is, say, the equivalent of the White House, can make a decision. And that goes to the provincial level, the municipal level, even down to the neighborhood level in China. And it's one line of authority, one chain of command. So things can get done very, very quickly, very efficiently here. If we contrast that with the United States, where, say, we can have a Republican president and put aside at the federal level, what we think of as these checks and balances that, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, but we can have a Republican president, a Democratic governor, say, in California, that not only can slow down, but actively derail an initiative from the federal government. And then we may even have a mayor that could be an independent, could be a socialist. And how do you get these different layers to work together, I think, is perhaps an insurmountable challenge in the United States. And I think this is why, American infrastructure now receives a grade of like D, right? Whether we talk about bridges, tunnels, just because the inability to upgrade them. And this is a huge, huge problem, I think, for the United States. And let me add one quick thing about that. It's not just government, but now we look at the legal system as well, in that any small interest group can, again, slow down or even completely block any meaningful infrastructure investment. And that sometimes it can be for good reasons, but it's the tyranny of the minority, maybe if we want to look at it that way, that for the greater good, there needs to be a new highway. The bridge needs to be fixed. There needs to be high-speed rail, or airports need to be upgraded. And yet there's this political gridlock that is separate from whether this is a democratic system or a neo-authoritarian system or whatever we want to call the ideology. But the actual mechanics of government, I think, are very, very different.
The plan looks to scale the economic growth model that saw China become the world's second largest economy.
China has been benefited enormously in the past 40 years by building strong and solid infrastructure. As you can see, size countries like China, to get the country to move around, and that's really the prerequisite of economic prosperity. And obviously, China has done that really well in the past 40 years.
China's economic rise started in 1978. The country abandoned its isolationist economic policies and began a process of gradually opening up to the outside world.
If you look at the whole process of China's opening up, it's quite interesting. It started with China's coast, and then opening up along China's major river, the Yangtze River, and then opening up along China's border provinces.
The country hit its stride in the 2000s when its economic openness was no longer limited to its eastern provinces, fully integrating into the global economy. This saw China begin overhauling its western provinces. The program reached its height with the completion of the Eurasian train line connecting Shanghai to Duisburg, Germany in 2009, creating the first economic corridor in today's Belt and Road Initiative. The economic push led to the largest reduction in poverty in global history.
It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's built massive infrastructure, and it's actually, in many ways, successfully moving itself from being a low-skill, low-wage economy to being a high-skill, high-wage economy with a big service sector.
In 2014, as part of the BRI, the rail line was extended to Madrid, a journey totaling 8,000 kilometers. And in 2017, trains from China began arriving in London, with the entire trip taking only 18 days.
The railway now covers a huge Eurasian continent, China-Europe Express. It's important because it saves time. It takes 2 weeks. If you go via maritime transport, it will take 6 weeks.
The Belt and Road has seen China revamp existing maritime routes to Europe through the port of Piraeus in Greece and the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. But the BRI is not just about retracing existing trade corridors. It also focuses on creating new ones. And with Italy and Argentina signing on as partners in 2019, new maritime routes to Europe and South America are in the works. But no continent stands to benefit more than Africa.
And Africa is a very fascinating continent. It has probably the youngest average age. It's probably going to double its population in the next 10 years. It is really ripe for an industrial revolution. For Africa to turn its vast raw materials into consumer goods and finished goods, it needs a country that has become practiced very recently in the processing of those goods. And China is the ideal partner for Africa. It has the finance, it has the skills to enable Africa to transform.
China has already opened the first modern trade corridor in Eastern Africa. In Kenya, China connected the port of Mombasa to the capital of Nairobi using the high-speed standard gauge rail. And plans are underway to extend the train tracks into neighboring Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Additionally, the completion of the port of Lamu in northern Kenya will allow for a new corridor to the energy resources of South Sudan and the products of Ethiopia. The projects are financed by Chinese banks, but the ownership lies solely with partner countries.
Africans don't want to be eternally locked into commodity producers. That's something that's historically been problematic. It echoes the colonial era relationship and relations with post-colonial Western states. They look to countries like China as emerging powers themselves, as thinking and understanding that they need alternatives, that they'd like to industrialize.
Though the Belt and Road is in its early stages, there have been some early fruits. In 2018, the BRI generated a trade volume of $1.3 trillion. China exported $700 billion worth of goods and imported $563 billion worth of goods from along the route, an increase of nearly 24% over the previous year. Chinese firms also invested over $15 billion in non-financial sectors within the developing economies of member states over the course of the year.
This is China actually reaching out to the rest of the world, helping fund and provide infrastructure. China's built a lot of its own infrastructure in the last 20 years, major programs in terms of building airports, roads, railways, and ports. And so they've actually acquired a lot of good technical knowledge of how to build on a large scale. That's very transferable to other emerging economies. So it's both capital from China and it's also know-how from China building infrastructure.